everyone, and thank you for those of you who could join. This is the COVID-19 Financial Oversight Committee. And really what we're having today is just a public discussion and presentation. It is not one of our official committee meetings. We will not have conversation and discussions about any of the American Rescue Plan funding. What we really want to get out of today, and we're very thankful for our social services team, who are going to present their most recent community needs evaluation. I had a preview of this and felt that it was very much like we had during our CARES Act, a community needs assessment to know the condition and the current environment of our residents of Davidson County. And it goes into a lot of depth and very, in a lot of different areas that we may find appropriate and necessary to later discuss funding. But at this point, what we want is for our social services team to be able to present their findings and their current information to the committee, so that as we start to talk about needs in the committee and the community, and we prioritize those needs, that you have that background. So I am going to, just a few other logistics. We would like folks to ask questions in the chat if it is something that you would like to discuss at the committee. We'll try to have some time tomorrow in our official public meeting to have those conversations. I think if there is a point of clarification to something that you see on the slide, just to understand a set of facts, that is fine to ask our speakers. Those type of questions, but anything that we would have as far as a conversation or deliberation as a committee, we will hold those till tomorrow when we are in person and under our public meeting guidelines. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over. Garrett, are you starting us off?
I can. Abdul Ghani, did you have any opening comments?
No, go ahead, Garrett.
All right.
Great, thanks, guys.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to share some information from this year's Community Needs Evaluation. I will share the screen. So thank you very much for inviting us to share information on the social and economic well-being of Nashville and Davidson County. And with that, I'll move here to our first slide. That we have conducted the Community Needs Evaluation for the past 12 years, really as that type of a document and report which can be helpful to the community at large, to elected leadership, policymakers, the nonprofit community, and provide that resource that looks both at the year-to-year changes that we see from data, but also to look at the long-term trends. And over the 12 years, that's become particularly important for us to see what patterns have emerged across time with the reports that we've produced. In the most recent year, the 2020 report, we had a introduction from Mayor Cooper, and he identified some of the things which we've experienced as a community, certainly that it was one of our most challenging years in the history of the city. The pandemic year was certainly the backdrop to so much of what we experienced as a city and the toll that meant for this community. But then in addition to that, as we all know, the devastating tornado that caused so much destruction in early 2020, and then the flooding through the year. So it was really a compounding of many different issues that were the big backdrop to our year. While Nashville has experienced modest improvements in economic and social well-being over the decade just passed, through 2019, and that's our real point of contact with the data, the pandemic, the year 2020 and now into 2021, has exposed many of the deep-rooted fractures that intensified fundamental disparities in the community. And each year, as we look at well-being, we take up a number of topics, many of which we'll look at here in just a few moments. But those which were apparent and part of that reporting year by year just became much more evident in significant ways, in some new ways in 2020. And we'll see those in a moment. But through 2019, we noted that poverty was actually falling just a bit. It was one of the lower rates of poverty as poverty is measured in 2019. Inequality, by some national measures that looked at that phenomenon across counties in the U.S., saw that there was a modest decline in inequality in Davidson County. We saw that median incomes had risen in the period 2013 to 2018 at modest levels. And we also saw that unemployment rates were at their lowest point of the decade, and in fact low comparatively with other cities across the country. So the resilience that is part of Nashville was evident in the 20-teens, but as we then move into 2020, as we reflect back on that, we recognize that the patterns that we saw for many years became very, very apparent then again to us in 2020. An important characterization of what occurred was really that roller coaster of the labor market and employment activity in Davidson County during calendar year 2020. We began the year with almost historically low levels of unemployment. Here, as we see, in the 2.7% range, approximately 10,000 unemployed, which was a quite low number for Davidson County, but then very abruptly in April, rising to nearly 16% to 60,000 persons unemployed. That began to subside through the year for a variety of reasons, as it did across the country, as there was, through fits and starts, a returning to normalcy. But we also think there, as we see the data revealed for the latter part of the year, 4.6%, 5.7%, that the unemployment rate simply is a measure of those persons who are in the labor force and are actively looking for work. The labor force participation is constituted by those that are working, those that are employed, or those that are actively looking for work. And because of the reporting which we've all encountered over the past year, we know that there are many workers who chose to not return to work. That's a phenomenon that's continuing into the present here in 2021. So in fact, a more robust counting of the unemployed, sometimes we think about those as persons who are working part-time but would rather work full-time, those that aren't working in the occupation they wish to. Various other considerations, even the discouraged worker who has simply left the labor force for a time. If we factor in each of those, we may think that the number of persons who are unemployed, not entirely by their choice, would be higher than is illustrated in the graph here. But nevertheless, it was a very aberrant year in terms of that activity where there's still a significant aftermath that we're experiencing in 2021. So what is a return to normalcy? Really, returning to normal confronts a number of important and long-standing challenges in our community. That in the Nashville economy, there are nearly 40,000 workers with full-time jobs with an average pay of under $12 an hour. And because our report was released in 2020, a lot of this data is only available and was reported through 2019. So we can imagine that some of the severity of these conditions, which are suggested here, may have intensified even in the time since the report has been released. That Nashville's poverty rate is higher than the U.S. average, has been higher for 7 of the past 9 years of data that was collected. That Nashville experienced the most consistently high poverty rate compared with many of those peer cities, Charlotte, Austin, Atlanta, others that we'll see in just a moment. In terms of the health of the population in Tennessee, our state experiences the fifth lowest life expectancy among all of the 50 states. In Nashville and Davidson County, more than 1 in 10 persons resident lack health insurance. So as we consider social and economic well-being, we recognize that it encompasses many facets of individual, household, and family life. And as we begin to look across these different domains, these different variables and data sets, the picture becomes clearer that there are some long-standing issues that were a part of the COVID experience in 2020, but many of those had prior relationship as a phenomenon in our community and simply were intensified during the period of the past year. This is that table that suggests how Davidson County has performed relative to a number of our peer cities, those that we often think of familiarly as the ones that we look to as a comparison set. This is the poverty rate reported by the U.S. Census Bureau through the American Community Survey as of 2019. This is the data for 2011 through 2019, so it's the entire decade. Red illustrates a higher level of poverty rate, green a lower rate. And the counties that we're exhibiting on this are those that are the central county for major metro areas that are part of this comparison set. So obviously Davidson County, the central county for the Nashville Metropolitan area of many counties, Franklin County for Columbus, Ohio, Fulton County for the Atlanta region, Hillsborough County, the Tampa area, Jefferson County for Louisville, Kentucky, Mecklenburg, Charlotte, North Carolina, and Travis County for the Austin, Texas metropolitan area. And then the United States poverty rate is shown at the bottom. So we see across most of the decade that the poverty rate was high and higher than the comparison set in most all cases. There was a bit of subsiding there in 2019, but we also recognize that the poverty rate itself is one that we want to consider carefully in terms of its construction, that the thresholds that are established for poverty are the same across the country, from dense metropolitan areas to rural areas. It is based on a formula that is now many decades old. It was established as one out of the U.S. Department of Agriculture that takes the food budget of a household and multiplies it by 3. It is the one that we use in our country for understanding poverty, but then there are other series developed by other organizations that suggest that it may be quite a higher threshold that's needed for households to really live not only comfortably, but just adequately in terms of the cost environment that an urban area like Nashville might present. So clearly this is a pattern which we've revealed here in sharing this data on the table, that it's not a one-year pattern, but there's a trend common across those years. And then, as we've done each year in the report, we provide maps that are significant for some of the characteristics that are most important to social and economic well-being. This first one relates to poverty, reminding us that 1 in 10 Nashville seniors, those persons 65 and over, live below the poverty threshold. That 1 in 5 children in Nashville under age 18 live in poverty. The map then illustrates, again, showing red being the higher rates and green, the darker green, the lower of the rates, that there are patterns and concentrations within Davidson County. These are the census tracts that are shown in this. I'll just point out there are a few there that don't have a color in them. There's not data provided for some, Cockrell Bend, the airport area, and so forth, Radnor Lake. So those anomalies within that. But nevertheless, we see a clustering effect of the red, where there are poverty rates in those census tracts usually for 4,000 to 6,000 people each. They're standard units of geography. And we see that there are some of those census tracts with a few thousand residents where the poverty rate is as high as, at least in one, 72.5%, and numerous others in the 30, 40, and 50% range, where well more than half of the people living in a census tract are living below the 100% mark of poverty. We also see some other clustering where there are relatively lower areas on the fringes of the county, particularly in the south and the southwest, where there are some census tracts that have very, very low, even near zero poverty rates. But the real importance of this continues to be one where we can identify patterns and clusters, that it's not so much a single census tract because they are very small units of geography, but where we find those adjacent to one another in some abundance. And then we begin to identify those as areas where there are significant issues with regard to poverty, perhaps multi-generational poverty, deep poverty, even those populations that live below the 50% level of poverty. Another phenomenon much reported on in the past year, included as well with a Nashville focus in the community needs evaluation, is the food insecurity level of the population. That in the year 2020, as reported by the national organization Feeding America, Davidson County's population experienced over 12% food insecurity. And for children in Davidson County, that was over 14%. In the map associated with this, we portray the percentage of households that are receiving SNAP benefits, means-tested programs to assist families and households with their food needs to supplement those challenges which they face in acquiring the food and nutritional items necessary for their family. Here there's some very clear clustering effect that appears, the red being the most intense, where there are census tracts where more than half of the residents in that small area are SNAP recipients. And there are numerous of those ranging here from 20% up to as high as 57%. There are some areas, we see the southwest of the county, where that's relatively quite low, even as low as 0. There is at least one census tract where there are no recipients among the households that are receiving SNAP benefits. So as we look at one map after the next in different contexts, we begin to see what those patterns across each of those are, and painting the picture of poverty and hardship and economic and financial struggle in a variety of different areas as households experience them. Education, certainly an important component of both the present and the future of a community. Educating children and youth to be the workforce of the future, and how well we as a community are doing in that, and where there are differences within the county, within the population itself. The reminder here in the data on the left is that only 1 in 5 MNPS, Metro Public School students, is ready to graduate with a regular high school diploma and expect to meet success milestones that would increase their probability to be successful in post-secondary education. The data that establishes this is regarding the ACT score of 18 or higher, a threshold score on the ASVAB test for entrance into the military, or for a high school student having participated in dual enrollment classes with post-secondary education institutions. So if a student has not achieved any of those measures, they would be deemed not fully ready with regard to milestones to be successful in post-secondary education. When we put that metric in place, then it's only about 20% of Davidson County students in the public schools who are at that measure. In the map, we see the adults, those persons 25 and over with less than a high school completion. And in this, there's a bit of a clustering, the red more in the interior of the city along some of the arterials to the northeast, to the southeast. And they're as high as 20, 30, even at least in one, 43% of the adults 25 and over lack a high school diploma. In some of the areas, again, the southwest of the county, that's quite low. But the challenge of this is that there are not small numbers, not insignificant numbers of the adult population that is fully prepared to meet the challenges, the opportunities that are presented in workforce as it is manifested in Davidson County now and going forward. Housing. a major consideration for any household, certainly because of the amount of resources it takes from the household budget. Some particular patterns, issues, topics, concepts, terms that are shared here. One of those is cost burden. When a household has to pay more than 30% of its annual income for its housing needs, it's deemed to be cost burdened with regard to housing. In other words, there's simply little left over as needed for the other requirements, the basic requirements of the family and the household budget. At the top left there, it reminds us that as of 2019, the most recent data that was available, nearly 1 in 5, nearly 20% here, 19.5% of homeowners spent more than 30% of their income on housing. Below that, in the bottom left, it tells us that 46%, nearly half of the renters in Davidson County spent more than 30% of their income on housing. And this is data from more than a year and a half ago, as it was provided from the Census Bureau. So certainly changes that have occurred since then may have certainly intensified some of what we see in the metrics that are shown here. In the blue box in the center, that the average house price in Nashville is 5.6 times the median annual household income, and that as of 2019, at the top, average costs for Nashville monthly shelter a year and a half ago were nearly $1,200 a month. In the map, the data is portrayed a little differently here to really hone in on what seems very, very significant to think about with regard to cost burden. There may be households that are relatively affluent and would have the means to support paying for housing at 30% or more of their earnings without difficulty. But the map here is showing the number of households that earn less than $50,000 a year and also are paying more than 30% or more of their income in rent. So in this case, we see a bit of a clustering, although we see a relatively widespread prevalence of those census tracts that are identified in red here. And again, the legend on this shows us that these are the number of households. So in each of these small areas, there are in the red anywhere from 476 up to over 1,100 of the households in that census tract who are earning less than $50,000 a year and are paying more than 30% of their income for rent. So even in some areas where the overall condition of households in terms of earnings may be relatively affluent, even in those areas, there are that many households, many hundreds, earning less than $50,000 and paying more than a third of their income in rent. Some of the clustering there in the fringes of the county show that there are relatively fewer of those. But as you see the numbers on those, in almost every part of the county, there are small areas of geography where there are many hundreds of households that are facing the condition that's portrayed here in the metric. The consistency of these patterns across time. As we've done over the past 12 years, it's reporting on what's occurred in the past year, as we did in 2020. It's bringing up those themes and topics and concepts that seem to permeate across time. So for the African American population in Davidson County, those unemployment rates before the pandemic on through have consistently been double that of the white population. So entering into pandemic year 2019, approximately 3% for the white population, approximately 6% for the African American population. But even those lower unemployment rates that we experienced in 2019 across all parts of the population may misrepresent the true quality of low-paying jobs, that simply because a person is employed, reflecting back on the earlier data point, the earnings may not be sufficient to support the household needs at an adequate level. The composition of employment within the population, African American population, Hispanic population, those with less education across the community. Employment levels down to, or an unemployment level down to a 3% range may still not indicate economic health and viability to sustain the needs of those households in a high-cost environment, and one that is increasingly so. The African American population we see out of data nationally has an inability to grow wealth comparable to that of the white population. One of the key factors in that is home ownership. That illustrates the ability for a household to accumulate wealth and equity, and also to be able to transfer that to the next generation. Education disparities are widespread in educational outcomes in public schools in Nashville as in elsewhere. Incarceration levels are higher, and we know from the correspondence between areas where there are larger numbers of African American population in census tracts, in zip codes, that there are higher levels of incarceration. Often reported is the nearby 37208 zip code, where is the highest level of incarceration and previously incarcerated in the nation out of 41,000 zip codes in the country. Housing inequities are common, the home ownership factor, and health disparities are many, both with access to care, with health outcomes, the prevalence of chronic conditions. And then a reminder to us across the population that with regard to workforce, over 41,000 Nashville adults lack a high school diploma. So any one of these factors, one's race, ethnicity, educational attainment, ability to gain access to care, to education, to building wealth, the compounding effect of those is a really powerful one, and one that plays out across time. The Hispanic and Latino population, large, continuing to grow in Davidson County. Nearly half of Hispanics over the age of 25 lack a high school diploma, nearly half. Nearly 1 in 4, 23% of Metro Nashville public school students is Hispanic. The poverty rates for the Hispanic or Latino population in Davidson County is more than double that of non-Hispanic whites. And across the non-citizen immigrant population of the city, an inability to access safety net programs, the benefits that are so important to fill in the gap, make up the difference for deficiencies that exist with regard to meeting basic household needs. That means that those persons are just certainly unable to obtain preventative health care along with other important needs. So the relationships here are particularly important for this large segment of the county's population. National policies, local policies, these have resulted in this. The patterns we illustrate in the document, in the report, aren't just of 1 year, but as the data show, across many years. And even thinking to the backdrop to those that are presented here, the historic and enduring effects of segregated neighborhoods, the effects of redlining policies nationally, and has been a part of the fabric of policy even in local areas in decades past, have enduring effects into the present with regard to settlement patterns, with regard to where services are established, where the transportation system and patterns themselves are defined and operated. Segregated schools, a legacy of many, many decades of that, continues to have effects both tangible and intangible. The segregated employment opportunities, differences in composition in the employment base for the white population, Hispanic population, African American population, mean real differences with regard to earning capacity, and that translates then into other facets that are important, such as home ownership, the ability to afford housing with regard to the costly environment that households encounter. But then there are the contemporary effects as well of policies and the implications that those have. For instance, the impossibility of viable public transportation systems in many ways. The large geography, the 500 plus square miles of Davidson County, the settlement patterns that have been established over decades, relatively not dense settlement patterns, but then the location of employment nodes relative to where residents live and how to link those as well in a very rapidly changing, gentrifying, transforming environment in a city as well that results in displacement of residents and neighborhoods. The transformations of just the most recent years really suggest that there is a lot of movement occurring within the county, that where we see the numbers of persons below 100% of the poverty threshold ranging between somewhere of 80,000 to 100,000 persons, that even as we see dynamic economic change, job growth, the number of persons living in poverty remains relatively static within the confines of Davidson County, pointing to this factor of the displacement of residents from neighborhoods. The mismatches between labor market needs and jobs, job creation that really is well suited to the educational attainment levels, to the realities of the resident community, and how to create the most viable and useful and important and targeted employment opportunities for those that are the resident population of Nashville. And mismatches that exist between those create further hardship between a cost environment that rises, that supports those locally and from elsewhere that are able to take on those roles, which may have significant educational requirements, but further diminishing the opportunity and the status of resident population that may not be prepared for the job opportunities that are emerging. So being highly thoughtful about that contemporary consideration of what's occurring in our city. One of the patterns that is playing out in the big backdrop of our nation with regard to earnings. So on the left here, we see the share of U.S. population who are earners or non-earners. Slightly more than half of the U.S. population are deemed the earners. So we may think, well, what are the earners and the non-earners? Which then on the right, we see that a very large part of the non-earners of our nation are children, elderly, persons with disabilities, students, those that have gone on to higher education full-time, caregivers or others in these other groups. The unemployed actually making up only a very small margin of the non-earners of our nation, and similarly for our state and for our city. As we think, though, particularly about what some of these changes are that are in place, the number of elderly, the share of elderly as a part of the total population continues to grow. That portion then will be a non-earner portion, putting a significant burden on our nation as a whole, on all communities, to support the non-earner part with those needs that are commensurate with those changes. So the reshaping of our society with regard to age cohorts, composition of our population relative to age, even students that continue on to higher education, a very good thing, very important thing for the sustainability of our labor force for many years into the future. But for a period of time, while persons may be full-time students, they're not active in the labor force until they graduate and become part of the earning class. As we take away the thinking from this, we've suggested in perspective associated with the data that was shared in the 2020 Community Needs Evaluation that the utility, the importance of economic growth that benefits all residents and all important institutions in their lives are interlinked in very important ways. That the pandemic, as extreme and pervasive and all-encompassing in our lives, really exposed the vulnerability of large numbers of people and of workers in leading industries. We think of hospitality, manufacturing, construction, retailing, that hardly any sector was unaffected for a period of weeks, months, and even into the future, that a resorting of the labor force and of the employment base of our nation, of our city, is occurring before our eyes. Anytime there's a major disruption, whether it's war or economic downturn, or in this case, pandemic, the aftermath is likely to see a lot of that resorting continue to play out. In all of this, as a part of the mission of Metro Social Services to empower residents with regard to their social and economic well-being, to be very cognizant of that term and what it means to define well-being, to articulate it, to identify a purpose-driven growth, economic change, economic development, community development, all of those with the thought of how this supports, benefits the well-being of resident population, really a value system that attaches those together as we reflect back on the data over a decade past. There are many aspects of poverty and those factors that touch on poverty. We often talk about the vicious cycle of poverty, the virtuous cycle of prosperity. Here, that cycle of poverty illustrates, starting at the top, work opportunity, wages that support abilities to support household needs, housing issues, access to jobs, to other needs, health, not just physical health, but mental, emotional, spiritual health, education, the education dividend for us both now and into the future, family structures, how those reshape and have changed over the decades, and how we may look very different as a community and society than some decades earlier. The social networks that communities have, that if an individual doesn't have access to a wide social network with different familiarity, with different systems of employment networks, educational opportunities, can be a limiting factor for those individuals. The historic legacies of racism, disinvestment in communities, effects of policies such as redlining in the past. The traumas of the past year are particularly evident, and then those legacies of access to resources. Each and every one of these are influencers and reinforcers one of another, hence that diagram there in the middle, that each thing points to one of the others, supports or detracts from it in important ways. The data indicate that there is a persistent poverty rate, as shown in the data compared with not just the nation as a whole, but compared to cities that Nashville compares itself with, and how even in the midst of economic growth, dynamic change, there has been a persistent chronic rate of poverty at heightened levels that points to some of these structural factors that exist, that this is becoming a more complex phenomenon, as with the changing of the age structure of our society, the aging of our population. It's becoming more costly. That in this complexity, there also requires great need to be creative and sometimes to continue to expend more resources to accommodate very difficult challenges, and also becoming more enduring. The long persistence contributes to further long persistence, absent changes in that dynamic of influencers and the reinforcers of poverty. The idea of traditional thinking, where a one-on-one effect, the one-to-one relationship between attentiveness to the food and nutrition needs of a community, the housing needs, education, transportation, health in all its dimensions. Each of those are important, but as we think about this in the systems context, there we begin to see how those influencers and reinforcers really are an important way to consider how the life of a city is performing, that each and every day the light switch literally doesn't go on for the city, but the city comes to life and plays out in all of its many different ways. How to be attentive to all of those ways simultaneously and in context, to try to broker a change, a transformation in that cycle of poverty and hardship that has been a chronic and persistent one for much of the community. Addressing poverty and well-being requires unified effort, that every element of household life connects to every other element. Aligning approaches to build opportunity that's involving innovation, commitment to sustained change, how to be artful, thoughtful, data-driven, systems driven systems thinking driven with regard to this as well. That recognizing too that all of society pays a price in tangible and intangible ways, in direct and indirect ways, for those that experience inadequate social and economic well-being. As the Community Needs Evaluation report identifies, there are over 12%, over 80,000 persons in Davidson County in 2019 living below the poverty level. About a third of the population of the county lives below the 200% level of poverty, of that threshold. All of that occurring in a city, communities where there is escalating cost environment that persons throughout neighborhoods and communities are experiencing. The cost then back to all of the community, public, private, nonprofit, collectively becomes a more costly one with regard then to education, transportation, health, meeting the food needs, housing, and the others, the interrelationships of those. Misunderstanding poverty hinders action. That understanding poverty in its complexity, understanding poverty as the manifestation of long-standing characteristics, factors that have legacy roles that continue to play out in our society. Thinking about poverty in those ways contributes to more ability to act toward that capably. The lack of continuity hindering action, that not simply being tied to election cycles, business cycles, other patterns of year to year, but over the long term. How do we instill ways that reflect back on this systemic understanding of poverty in ways that have the continuity that's needed to really interrupt and transform that cycle of hardship that families experience? Ensuring that there's alignment between economic and community development for the priorities of well-being, for the social and economic well-being of the nearly 700,000 persons living in Davidson County, ensuring that the policy, program, in all those cases, look back on the values of how they support the social and economic well-being of the residents of Nashville. Those help to stimulate and align the action in ways that are sustainable. Local decisions have enormous influence on well-being for advancing action on this, that it's not always international or national or state policies, but a lot of decisions around education, transportation, health, food, housing are local decisions, whether those are land use policies, programs in business development, in community development. These are ways to identify at the local level and manage those in ways that are highly influential, that have brought us to this point, and that can bring us to different junctures with regard to well-being of the population. Accepting proven results and rejecting disproven approaches, where there's evidence that shows what works and evidence that shows what doesn't work, and applying those consistently and cohesively with regard to programs and policies. And the idea of the well-being cabinet, in terms of ownership, what type of ownership is there over poverty and economic and social well-being? In some ways, the responsibility of the full community, but to think about that in terms of thought leadership that has always an awareness and understanding and serves in a reminding capacity of those values that attach together the community between the well-being of the resident population and how programs and policies are both formulated, enacted, implemented, and evaluated. So continuing to think about that as we go forward, one of the ideas introduced with this year's community needs evaluation. We provide a variety of reports. This is the capstone, the signature report each year, which we share with the community at large. We typically would hold events. We were unable to do so because of pandemic year, but had wide distribution for that. Certainly appreciate the community's involvement and input with that report and document. And after the 12 years of it, really beginning to express some of the perspective there that offers suggestions and insights that begin to emerge out of some of the data series and topics that we've portrayed and that we've had opportunity to share today with this committee. So I want to thank you at this point for this, and I would like to turn it over to Abdelghani. I believe he may have comments at this point.
Well, thank you, Garrett. I think the data is clear, and what we proposed in terms of addressing poverty is to look at the structural things that result in poverty, but not just to focus on things that are emotionally attached to poverty, where, there is such a rhetoric and say, let us do this, let us do that. I think we need to look at the fundamental things that exist in a community, whether it's about education system, workforce development, land use policy. All of those things are things that can make things better in the long term. So I think you've captured everything we needed to share. And we are open if any of the committee members have any questions about the report. Mary, any questions?
I think as panel members, you can unmute yourself if you do have any questions. I have just one about the slides. Will we be able to get the slides and distribute those to the committee members?
Yes.
Okay, that's great. If there aren't any questions, or if, I just saw Councilwoman Sepulveda.
Yes, I did have one question. I was trying to put it in the chat, but I don't think the chat was working for us, or at least it wasn't for me. Do you have data specifically on which labor field was impacted the most during the pandemic?
There is some data for that. There's been some national study of cities and metropolitan areas with regard to their employment bases. So for instance, the composition of the Nashville area with regard to it, where there were certain industries that were more intensely impacted, and where those metropolitan areas fared in terms of that. So there is some data. I'll be glad to share that, yes.
Great. And if you want to send that data to me, Garrett, I can send it to the committee.
Thank you.
And what I was going to say is, if you have questions after, again, please feel free to, post any of those, you pass those questions to me. I will reach back out to social services. We'll get those, and then we'll address them in our committee meeting. So this isn't your last chance to ask a question. If you think of something, either, just whenever or after you get the slides and you're looking at it. So. All right. Well, I won't keep us all here. I sure appreciate everybody's time this morning, especially to our team from social services. Thank you for presenting. Thank you for actually, doing the work and accumulating the data so that we have something for a presentation, and really kind of informing this committee about the current environment and how we can use this information to make decisions with some of the American Rescue Plan funds. So I will go ahead and close us out. Thank you all and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information on this and other programs, visit nashville.gov.